Hello there, it's time to play some Timberborn. This is a beaver-themed city builder. Well, I say it's beaver-themed, we'll get into that in a second. But just first, I'll mention I'm using the normal settings, the normalist settings. We've picked the recommended map, there are several maps you can play on, and normal difficulty. There isn't a tutorial, but when you start the game it basically does you a tutorial in the form of giving you some objectives that tell you basically what you need to do. And it is the standard sort of thing. We need to collect some resources around the starting area and make a few buildings. It's a city builder. And I suppose this leads me directly into the first big thing to mention. There's two big things to mention, and I'm going to level both of them as potential complaints and try to get them out of the way as early as possible, and then mention them less as we go along. We're here in the post-apocalyptic world. The humans are gone, you can see their ruins around the map, and you can even use them for resources later. And the map has a very distinctive Minecraft-esque look of blocks and areas that are irrigated and areas that aren't, because to some extent this is a water management game. There isn't much water available. But you're a beaver. Does that matter? No. And I think that's the most shocking element of this game, is that its unique selling point, that it's a beaver city builder, is almost completely wasted. They do almost nothing with this concept whatsoever. This game is nearly identical to any city builder, any sort of colony builder style game. There is really nothing about beavers in the game. That's what I'm complaining about right here. I came here for the beaver stuff. It's not here. The nearest thing we have is that you can dam the river, although in a very human way. Your beavers don't live in the river, and they can't swim. They can't even drink water from the river. You have to make a water supply in a very human fashion by making pumping stations and storing it in set distribution locations. And it is, I think, a huge mistake, because this game does have damming, as I said, and water management, where you can change waterways by using dams, and use that to create reservoirs to overcome the main challenge of the game, which is that now and again the river will stop flowing, and you'll have to survive without there being any water on the map, except the stuff you've kept on the map, either through your damming or through just putting it in barrels, which is what I'm setting up right here. And that's the best part of the game. I thought that would be the main part of the game, but it's actually really a sideshow to a farming simulator. Your city building experience is about making houses and manufacturing facilities and farms, which is so normal. I guess I just didn't expect it to be like this in any way. I expected it to be completely different to what I'd played before, just off the bat, and it isn't. So there you go, we're just playing really a normal city builder. You'll notice that the citizens are beavers who behave exactly the same as humans 99% of the time, and that's that really. But the mechanics around it are still a bit different in that we have this irrigation concern. There are places on the map where you can't grow food, basically, the places that aren't green. So that limits how you can build, and you have to plan around that, and we'll see how I do with that as we go along. And you can change what places are irrigated by attempting to divert rivers using dams. Although this is very difficult, it's certainly not an early game activity, and that is what I wanted it to be. I wanted it to be more about that, and concern beaver-style engineering, and not human-style city planning, I suppose. Well, that's what we've got. We're playing it anyway, so that's just the big thing to mention up front. I'll not talk about it again until we talk about damming, I suppose, in a bit. But the beaver stuff doesn't matter. Now, the second thing I mentioned is that this is, like a recent city builder I played, a no-numbers game. I don't know how to describe it. The recent game I mentioned is Caesar 3, and in that game I mentioned what I'm talking about as Zen mechanics. The idea is that you have an economic management simulator where there are all kinds of numbers you need to manage, but you don't see the numbers. So, for example, we have to pump a certain amount of water right now into the barrel on the screen to keep our people alive, our beavers alive. How much water do we have to pump? We don't know. How much water does the pump we have create over each day? We don't know. So it's a no-numbers game. I don't know how to describe this, where you have to do vibes-based economic management. And in Caesar 3, I both criticized it for being like this, and then ultimately came to embrace the vibe, and just think it's kind of nice when you don't really know what's going on, because your potential for perfection is so low, the game becomes so effectively difficult, that you don't feel the need to succeed, because you simply can't. So what I'm saying is we've got this again in this game, where we don't really know how the economy is going to be working. We're going to guess how much of everything to produce, we're going to guess how much we're using, and the only real measure we have is that set of numbers at the top left. Those are the numbers offered in this no numbers game. We know how much water we have, but of course that's not what you need to know. You don't even need to know how much you have, you need to know how much you need and how much you make, those two numbers. And every time I play an economy game, I find myself leveling that criticism at the game, that these very easy to tell the player numbers that are essential to everything are either not there, or they're a bit too hard to work out, like in Anno 1800 where it did tell you, but it was just like 2 clicks away from the place where you needed to use that information, and it didn't need to be like that. So we're back at it again. I want to be spoon-fed the relevant information, but it is a legitimate game design choice to simply not provide that information at all, because it does, after all, stir up drama, I suppose. Like, if you just told the player you need to have this amount of farmland to sustain your current population, they might actually do it, and then they might actually sustain their current population, and that's less dramatic than just finding out long after you can do anything about it that you can't sustain your current population, or something like that. And there are all kinds of economic factors that will stack on top of each other and begin creating a House of Cards style economy, and I presume the developers want it to collapse in some way, because while it would be very easy to manage it because it's so deterministic, if you just shield that information from the player, then that's a game. You've made a game to some extent, but I'm saying I don't really prefer this kind of setup. I would rather know, because I'm a perfectionist, I suppose, or something. I feel a slight anxiety for not knowing whether this setup is sustainable, or not knowing the income and outgoings of the various things I'm supposed to care about. And this is a game where it does matter more to actually have a handle on those numbers. Whereas in Caesar 3, you could very quickly restructure your economy, it didn't really matter. Like, if you noticed a small problem, you could deal with it right away. So maybe it was okay that you couldn't have predicted the problem. Here, the problems that come from not knowing your various ingoings and outgoings can be large and take a long time to deal with, and you can get feedback loops where not dealing with a problem can cause that problem to become undealable with. Similar to how I am so bad at speaking English that I am unable to read the English text that would be required for me to learn the rest of English. The long and short of all this ranting is that I nearly didn't play this game after the first sit-down session, because I have plenty of other things I could play right now, and I kind of forced myself to play it a second time, and it was after that I started getting into this as essentially a human city builder, and just ignoring my misgivings, just dropping the whole idea that it's about beavers in my mind, and trying to live with the not knowing of the information, because I had learned to live with it in the previous city builder I played. I thought, we can get through this, let's just make a bunch of wooden houses and farms on a riverbank, and that can be a game. It's still fun in its own way, because making things is fun. It's a good formula, the human city builder, but potentially not appropriate to what I expected from the theme, I suppose. We are now officially going to stop mentioning that until I get mad, probably in about 30 seconds, and start mentioning it again as usual. Let's talk about what the game actually is instead of what it isn't. Nope. It's the next day now, and I realise before we get into the rest of the game, I have another thing I need to mention up front, which potentially undoes part of the criticism I just made, or made yesterday from my perspective. This game is in early access, and it is version 0.2. That's a very low version number. By the way, this footage in the background is me looking for a stats screen, hoping to find out our production numbers. Unfortunately, that mission failed. Well, knowing me, there probably is one in the game somewhere. Well, I never found it. Anyway, so yes, version 0.2. That's a very low version number. So this indicates that they intend to change the game a lot, because they're not even going to commit to it being half done. Well, this is a game that, while it's in early access, as far as I can tell, it's been in early access for a long time, because I'd heard of this game a long time in the past. I think it had an open beta years ago, and then it's been in early access for a couple of years. And this is 2 updates down the line from early access. We are in the bottom right corner, you can see almost in version 0.3 now, and version 0.3 actually came out while I was playing the campaign. We'll mention that later on because it is something notable. Anyway, so much may still be changed, so I'm going to put that disclaimer up here before we get into the rest of the game, because it seems fair. The game itself, when you start it up, actually pops up saying that the game is unfinished, although it has been out for years and you can buy it, so it's finished enough to be on the market. It's always hard to know where to toe the line with early access games, because it can be used as a shield to say, well, you can't criticize the game because it's unfinished, but they're willing to take the money, and the money's the same either way from the consumer's point of view, so you have to give me enough at the very least. But it's not beavery enough. Will the remaining 0.7-ish worth of version number they've got be enough development time, enough idea space to change the game such that essentially what we're seeing now is the end game and the game begins more beaverishly? I guess I'll try and explain what I'm envisioning here when I say this, because it's probably not clear at all. Something where the main focus is diverting rivers because the beavers live in the water, which seems like a perfectly plausible and fun way to use this map system they have. Because you can imagine there being resources at certain points on the map, and you have to make dams and do water engineering to make underwater habitats near those resources and sort of travel your little beaver civilization around the map by changing where the river is at different points in your progression. And then later on, you would access the technology to overcome the limitation of needing to do that by being able to live entirely on land and put roads down and things like that to reach resources that are away from the rivers. Well, that's just what I thought the game could be like. It's much more focused on water management from the perspective of gathering water to survive droughts. And this is what your economy is ultimately for. That's the thing that's coming to kill you. It's okay, it's not necessarily bad. It sounds like I'm hating on the game. It's actually perfectly fine as a city builder, and I like the challenge of overcoming the droughts. It's a lot like Frostpunk if Frostpunk didn't tell you your production numbers. That's the big difference between this and Frostpunk. And Frostpunk only has one economy. This is a multi-economy game, something like Anno 1800, and I'll explain what I mean by that once I have to deal with it, basically. Now let's get into the game properly. We'll take a look at this droughts business first. You can see on the right I started trying to dam the river to prevent this being too much of a problem, but damming the river is a very slow process, especially in the early game. So maybe you can't realistically do it before the first drought comes, and you don't really need to because it's not too bad at first. Essentially what it means by drought is that the river flowing into the map will stop flowing, and you can see it defertilizes the ground instantly. That water flows right away. So we're going to have to deal with that, and there are two problems this creates. One is that your beavers need to drink the water, the other is that the plants your beavers need also like to drink the water. So the lack of water on the ground will prevent your pumping stations working, and it kills off the plants, as you can see here, so our farms and forests are in trouble. But in the meantime, I've discovered what is, I think, something really good about this game, the verticality element. A lot of buildings can be made on top of each other, and you can make stairs and platforms and walkways to make some very cool looking, in the late game anyway, multi-layered custom buildings, effectively. It's something that's very expensive to do, so I didn't do it very much, especially at first. The fact that making even stairs requires you to refine wood into planks first, which is a massive bottleneck in your production of interesting buildings, makes me think that maybe it might have been a more interesting balancing decision to allow some verticality to happen without having to have that layer of manufacturing, because essentially we can't do that manufacturing here because you require the water to spin a wheel to make planks. And it seems to me pretty plausible that you could make a ramp up to somewhere without having to work the wood first. Our beavers are up to it. And I just missed out, I think, on some early game fun by not having access to not only the terrain that's on the different height level to us, but to being able to build on the roofs of my own buildings, which is fun, but too expensive, that's what I'm trying to say here. Another thing to keep in mind is that our farms are incredibly inefficient. I was surprised by this. Your farms have a really long range about where they can farm, but perhaps 10% of that range is their de facto space they can farm in, because the employees in the farms take an incredibly long time to do anything. So what I found early on is that usually my farms all had all of their crops maximally grown. They just weren't being harvested because it takes too long for the farmhouse to do it. So it's super inefficient. You need to spam farmhouses over a very small area, and most of their range will be wasted, which was a bit counterintuitive. The forester here has a similar problem in that once all of its trees are planted, the forester itself is a waste of employee. So for optimal gameplay, you should be constantly turning your farms and foresters off and on to save employees, and I don't like that you have to do that. I'd rather it be more fire and forget, really. Well, we're going to try and set up some more foresting activity on the left there, because the huge bottleneck for everything is your supply of trees. Trees take a long time to grow, and they're used for virtually everything, so you use them up instantly all the time, especially early on. So we are very slow to do anything in the game because of that. Here's the other issue. The water wheel that I need to make the planks to make anything more interesting than the basic buildings doesn't turn all the time. There's some pretty good and I think really interesting fluid physics going on in this game. Another suggestion that the game should have been more about that from the beginning. I really like the way they've simulated where water goes, and it's down to the accuracy level where it does matter where in the river the water is flowing faster. My water wheel isn't in the right place. I learned later, by the way, you can actually build the water wheel not on the edge of the riverbank. You can just put it in the middle and it works much better, so we'll see that later on, but I just presumed that wouldn't be the case. It is much more expensive because building in the water is annoying for various reasons, but maybe we'll get to that. So anyway, we've got issues there. We can't make planks. I need the planks to make gears, which are required for other things, but that's going to be a long time coming. We're far behind that layer of the building tiers, I suppose. Essentially, we just need to get some trees in so I can put that dam up. Unfortunately, I did not finish the dam before the next drought came along. It just takes a long time to get trees, basically, and they were being used for tons of other things as well at the same time. I wasn't well planning or prioritizing my expansion. So we've got most of the dam by the time the river stops flowing. This does keep the water in the river a little bit, so for a bit longer, for some of the first day, we still have some irrigation going on, meaning this drought cycle will be easier to deal with than the last, and if we're very lucky, all of the crops might not die. The trees don't die from droughts that are this short, but the crops can. It does mean our pumping stations will stop working, but we have barrels of water all over the place, and I think it's just about enough, the amount I'm storing here. Obviously, we don't know the numbers. I anecdotally remember running out just as the drought ended. It seems my water wheel must have spun enough for me to get enough planks to put all these stairs in. We're starting to build up on the high bit of terrain on the left there, and we're putting some houses on top of our other houses. Obviously, space is going to be at a premium, because we need that space to make more trees and to make food at some point as well. So that's where the verticality comes in. There's some strategy to be had here, and I like the creativity, the design aspect of it. Here was a weird thing. The level 2 house that holds twice as many beavers has to have its entrance on the second floor, which is really annoying basically, but it does force you to do some interesting things, like that, perching it on the edge of a cliff so the upper part of the cliff can be where the beavers get in. So I kind of like it. I guess I would like more, though, to also have a version where the door was downstairs, just because it's more convenient that way, and it doesn't make sense why it has to be upstairs. It's just sort of a contrivance here to make you do something interesting. I'm fine having just the interesting thing as an option. Anyway, we come to the end of this drought. A thing to note about the droughts is they all last 1 day longer than it says they do. Because if you look in the top right, the water only reaches our town at the end of the day after the drought. So we actually went a full day of extra drought, essentially. The good news is that during the drought, I finished this dam section. So the water will now sort of 80% fill up in the river. The dams do let water through. This is different to a levee, which is a slightly different kind of dam that actually floods the area. So this is what we need for now, because we don't want the river to burst its banks. We're going to keep some of the water flowing through. The water wheel is turning, it's a miracle, but that's just sort of off and on. The fluid dynamics seem to change during the day for some reason. Don't quite know how it's working, but that's good. And this all just means next time there's a drought, water will stay in the river for a bit. Water just drains through the ground in this game as well, so you can't just make a reservoir and then that's your permanent source of water. It still goes away. I presume it's evaporating as well. But this is better than what we had before. Now what I want to do is build on the other side of the river. There's tons of premium land over there for us to use. So I'm putting this bridge in. That's an incredibly expensive thing to build plank-wise, so it will take a long time to do it. I think in retrospect, you could just put stairs down into the river and some stairs on the other side of the river, and your beavers would sort of know that that means they can cross the river and swim across it. I'm not quite sure, but later in my gameplay, I was beginning to realize that maybe you can get the beavers to swim across spaces of water. I actually, at the time of recording this, still haven't confirmed or tested that, but whatever the case, for now, we're putting a bridge over the river, and it's just going to take a hugely long time. This footage, by the way, of me just looking around, I put here just to mention again that throughout this early game, when we're just farming stuff and generally not doing anything on a moment-to-moment basis, I was constantly thinking about how interesting it would be to be doing more water stuff. So I'm just back at my earlier complaints. I was looking at the environment and thinking, here's a place we could send the water, here's a cool place to dam, here's a place we might want to try and split the river and have multiple rivers going in different directions if we can organize that, stuff like that. I was interested by that idea, and this is in the game, and it is to me the best part of the game, but we are still a ways off getting there yet. And once again, I just wish somehow some of that could have been incorporated a bit earlier on, because this part, well, there's nothing really happening. I need to do some waterworks right now to get this wheel going. You can see I started putting this bridge in front of it. What I thought I would do is put a bridge to almost the other side of the river and then dam part of the other side to have the water be going mainly under the water wheel. That's the idea. After mentioning it before, I did actually go and find out between these various clips that you can put stairs down into a river and then build on the other side of it. So I could have set up my waterworks system here easier. For now though, the fact that you need planks to make bridges and I need bridges to make planks means we're stuck here for a really long time, but generously I'll be cutting that out. But basically just know I was miserable and not having very much fun and not achieving very much here in the early game of Timberborn, which I'll say is my general impression of the game overall so far, having played quite far through it now. It definitely gets better as the time between you knowing what to do and having an idea and the time for it to actually happen begins to decrease as your economy gets better. At first though, very, very slow going. You can see what I'm trying to do here. I want to have this water wheel be the main place the water's going, and building levees instead of dams, which is what I'm trying here, is the way to do it essentially, because they're cheaper for some reason despite being bigger than the dam pieces. They just block the water a bit more, so it will really force it through under the water wheel. Should have been doing that from the beginning. Plus they functionally act a bit like bridges as well, in that your beavers can walk across the top of them, so you don't need to put out a scaffold effectively, which is what I was sort of doing at the other water wheel. Well, never mind all of that. Right now we're in the down cycle where you wait for your trees to come back and nothing happens for a long time. And the nothing happening factor is increased by the fact I'm trying to set up this second economy over here. I mentioned you have a multiple economy system in this game. Well, here we are facing it. The basic gist is that your town has a district hub, or it did have one district hub, which defines the range at which you can build things. So the hub is like the middle of an area, and the lines going along the roads are how far away beavers are allowed to go from this hub. So if you want to expand somewhere else that's not near where you started the game, you have to put down another hub, but the new hub creates a completely independent economy, which brings up all sorts of issues. Obviously it's done as a deliberate choice. It sort of seems unnatural to do it like that, so they wanted it to be like this. But what it means in practice is that the beavers on this side of the river don't know about the other side of the river, so we can't use anything we've built so far to help out with what we've got new on this side of the river, and that's going to slow things down entirely. You are effectively starting the game again when you start a new district, and it just feels very strange because it's so close to everything I've built so far, and it can't use any of those facilities, any of those resources, even though they're right there. Well, this was frustrating, clearly a game design choice. It reminds me of Anno 1800, the game I cited earlier, where you would have different islands with their own economies, and it's a similar deal here, where the UI is constantly changing at the top as well, so the numbers you see are the numbers from one of the districts, and the more districts you have, the more confusing that's going to get. Although sometimes, I think if you have nothing selected, it shows you your resources of all the districts, which is extra misleading because of course they don't share resources, so it shouldn't even do that really. It's a case where I just thought, wouldn't this be much easier, faster, and leave me sitting around doing nothing less if I could use the resources I'm making in my first town to build the second town. That seems like the natural thing to do. The issue, of course, we're going to have is that there's no food or water supply to this new town. So I worked to get the water going. The food is a much slower process because it takes forever to build the farms and then forever to farm the stuff. So my temporary solution here is to micromanage our beavers by constantly reassigning them to the old town. This means they'll go back, eat food while they're there, and then we can assign more beavers to go back to the new town and keep building on it until they get hungry again, which is a roundabout way of achieving how I wanted the game to work, i.e. they would just go over there and get the food if there is none in the nearby food centres. So they want you to think about this idea of having separate economies, and we'll see in a moment there is a way to move things between the economies, and that's supposed to be part of the game. What I can't do though is explain why this might be good. I kept thinking, is this fun? And thinking that maybe it was. Maybe it is interesting to have separate economies and have to work with that in some way, like you would make a specialist district that is focusing on something based on its local resources and then exporting it to another district. But this could all be done without the district system as well, and it would be easier and have fewer UI demands and just be clearer and probably happen faster, get the game going a little bit more. It just seems unnatural for these economies to be next to each other but separated, and I can't escape the feeling that it would be more fun to be building one continuous settlement where like each thing you do is building upon something you've done before, so there's a clear continuous progression. The sort of starting again vibe of making a new district and having to go back to just harvesting a few logs and waiting ages to make one house. It's just not especially fun. It feels like you're not progressing in the same way you would if you could just immediately harness the industrial power of your first town to build the second town. Or even better, just have it be all one town, less UI, less hassle. Well anyway, we'll see that gets worse obviously as we go along because we have to set up more and more separate economies and it gradually gets out of control. But for now, I finally set up the water system I wanted. We've got the water mainly flowing under the water wheels, so now we can manufacture planks, which are a prerequisite for all sorts of things, and all of the verticality based mechanics as well require you to have lots of planks. So we'll be able to build up a bit more as well, which is useful because we are running out of space since I'm harvesting so many trees, because indeed we need tons of trees for everything, and even late in the game I was constantly running out of them. Anyway, you can see what we need to actually do is unlock buildings. I've barely unlocked anything. We have to pick something to build and then make it using the science we're gradually accumulating. And I chose here to grab the distribution post. So this is the building that does what I wanted. It allows you to move things to other districts. Although, of course, the system for moving things is very flaky. You move certain amounts of things sometimes, so it's an inconsistent supply. And one little thing you can't do is just say, send 10 planks to District 2. You can only say, send a supply of planks to District 2 until we've run out of planks, or until our plank supply goes down to a certain amount, which is just a little bit harder to control, and in my experience tended to mean you sent way more things than you needed on the distribution route. Well, that's just my anecdote anyway. I'm not quite clear how it works even yet, but it does somewhat work. You can move things between districts, you just have to micro it and commit a bunch of employees to doing it. Essentially, what I'd like to see is perhaps just a more user-friendly or intelligent way of doing things where your hauling posts could do this for you. You can cut out the distribution post idea because it's a waste of employees half the time. It's really annoying to micro. One of these things where I'm anxious of the fact that if you commit employees to a distribution post and a lot of the time they're not moving things, those employees are wasted and you're not keeping an eye on that missed opportunity. Might be easier to just combine the hauling post and the distribution post, two very similar types of building, into one concept and allow hauling posts to move things to other districts for you. I feel like that would be easier, and if it would do things like notice that another district doesn't have planks while it needs them, so you've set up a blueprint to be built that requires them and it doesn't have any, the hauling post would just take them there. In the same way it can work within one district. That is to say, I'm once again advocating that the district system be removed, and essentially that the map act as one economy and stuff just be taken where it needs to. It can be done now, but you have to babysit where the supplies are first. You have to get them close, and then they'll take them where it needs to be. And because you have to do that manually, it's very inconvenient. It just sort of breaks the pace of everything. Feels like that doesn't need to be part of the game. It's not an especially fun option to include. You can see I've increased my plank production by avoiding the water wheel system. You can produce power for industrial buildings by just having a beaver walk in a wheel, which is quite fun, I thought. Uses more employees, but far less resources, and gives you tons of freedom about where to put it as well, so it's probably a more viable option. Another new development I've unlocked is the irrigation tower. So we can now forcibly irrigate an area by just having the haulers move water to a tower from the water supply, and then you can grow things in new locations that aren't near the river. So this is a way of getting new arable land without having to do waterworks. Again, this is much cheaper, but sort of more annoying to set up and less fun as well. We're going to be switching back to doing waterworks as much as possible once we have an economy that can functionally do that, and once I get to grips with the district system a bit more so that I can build further away from my town. We're sort of at the limits of how big the town can be right now without really committing to the district system, and I kind of didn't want to as well. Here's a little look at this distribution system that I'm advocating shouldn't be in the game. You pick your post, and then you pick where it's going to take something to. So you build a specific little depot for them to take things to. So I say take it to this depot in the other district. You pick a thing to send there. In this case I need to send some food because the food production on the other side isn't good enough. And then it just sort of does it on its own, but you can also open up this second menu to have some control over the amount of stuff that gets sent. I didn't really intuit how this menu works. You have this low-high thing next to berries there, for example. Whether this is the low or high at your end or the other end, I actually still don't know. Because I kept thinking it's the low and high at my end, but then seeing contradictions where it would take resources way below the low aspect. So essentially it's similar to a system in Anno 1800 to control the supply of things between the separate economies, but just not quite as good. So I can't even remember what the Anno 1800 system was. I just remember not having any trouble with it and not understanding it. So let's just say it should have been more like Anno 1800, and that's something I rarely say. Let's try and find more things where I can say it should be like Caesar 3 instead. My irrigation tower that I set up here actually isn't going to work because it's slightly too far away from the district center. We have this red line system, which I think would be much better done by just telling you where the range ends. I think right now it ends as the color gradient stops changing. Probably clearer to just say where it ends, because that's what you need to know. So we'll need to put a new district up there, which I have to do anyway to grab the metal that's up there, at some point anyway. I don't want to do it because it's not only inconvenient to micro, but that's a bad place to build if there are no resources. So we'll have to work something out. In the meantime, let's do something I do want to do. We're going to do some water engineering. I need to dam the river I'm on, essentially, so that the upriver section is deeper. Then by using this floodgate, we can artificially have the river keep flowing a bit during a drought by just draining out the stuff that's built up in the deeper section into the downriver section. So that's the idea. As mentioned earlier, this is a very expensive process. So you have to have quite a developed economy to get this going. It's going to take hundreds of trees to make even this small dam section. But eventually it will happen. I also have to build this scaffold in front of it. I don't think I really need this in this case, because I could let the beavers go into the river by putting stairs into the river and then they would build it down there. But the scaffold will help because it allows us to build higher, and we are going to need to do that eventually, as we'll get to. Had some trouble there because I couldn't delete the path on top of the levee section without deleting the levee section as well. This actually can be done, I later found out, by clicking wildly until it selects the path instead of the levee system, and then there's a different delete button. Just a slight confusion there. I should note that you don't get any resources when you deconstruct your own buildings, but in a future version of the game you do. In the version I don't have, one of the features they added is that you can recycle buildings to get some of their cost back. It's just unfortunate that I don't have it in this save because I was deleting things constantly due to making mistakes. I've put a new irrigation tower down on the other side of the river to try out how this works. So we're just going to farm this random patch over here. I put it deliberately on the edge of our range to have it be roughly as far away as possible, so that there's space for us to use in between for building other things. Now a bit later the dam is coming along, so we're going to block this river off. This means the river will be one tile higher than the main river section that our town is on, and our little floodgate will allow us to bring some of it through at our leisure, and the floodgates are controlled by the player rather than by the beavers. And I think that's essential. I think that's really good. The ability to micromanage the water just as a separate god entity is more fun to me than allowing the beavers to do it. So anyway, we're now flooding the upper river. The problem with this is that because I have only one floodgate, the water doesn't flow fast enough to get off the map in time, so it means the river will burst its banks and will gradually flood the land around it, and some of that land is above us and on a level I'm using. So essentially, this setup I've got right now will eventually flood my entire town slowly but surely. We're slightly limited as well by the fact I don't have floodgates at the end of the river, so I can't speed the river up to make water flow through faster. It will only flow out at a certain speed at the moment. So stuff starts to flood, and some of that stuff is my town. What does this do? Well, nothing too bad. I thought it might destroy your buildings or something like that. But essentially a flooded building just switches off, and if you unflood it, it comes back. There's no damage, no resources cost associated with flooding everything. So that's fine, although it does kill the crops and the plants. The trees will last a long time underwater though, so that's not so much of a worry. Essentially, we need more floodgates so we can increase the speed of flow. For now though, we can just delete parts of the dam, which is good because we'll have to delete them anyway to put the floodgates in, so we're not really losing anything. We just miss out on the resources, but if you play the game now, you wouldn't miss out on the resources. So here we are later with 3 floodgates instead. By having 3 and lowering them more, we can have the output of the river be not so much different to the input, so the rate of flooding back there is a bit slower. But of course, the ultimate solution, which will not only stop me having to micro the floodgates all the time, it will also allow us to have more water stored back there, is to wall off the vulnerable sections so that the river can just be deeper back there without it being a risk. The other advantage is that the south bank of the river is much higher than the north, so if we wall off the north quite a lot, we can actually make the river way deeper back there and have it be something more like a reservoir, have a tall dam holding a huge amount of water back, and then we'll be much safer from drought but more vulnerable to flooding if I mess it up. And of course, I am going to mess it up, as we'll see. We'll need to remove a few things on the riverbank to do that. You can delete trees in a way that is different to cutting them down, but you don't get the resources, so I was hesitant to do it there. That will mean that whole thing is going to take a long time to set up, because our beavers will eventually get to cutting down those trees, but not for a while. In the meantime, I am setting up this new town I talked about. We need something to use our new irrigation tower, and to have access to the metal at the north. There's also another reason behind building here specifically that I was thinking about. To the west, there's this channel, and if I wall off this channel, while also damming the main section of the river to the south on the other side of those mountains at the bottom of the screen, we will end up with a situation where I can flood a massive section of the map to the left-hand side of the screen, and we'll have tons of water back there basically. We're going to do an actual dam that creates a lake, that's the new plan, and then that enormous lake will be able to flow through at my command, not just the deeper parts of the river, and we'll have tons of water stored up, because we don't need to survive the droughts just by having water in tanks and having the beavers survive. We want the ecosystem to be unchanged by the drought, that's the actual goal, so that your crop production and tree production is not interrupted. We want the river to be flowing at all times, so we need the upriver section to just be completely flooded as much as possible, that's the plan. Well, for now, things are working out because we're in the drought right now. The river isn't flowing, but it's still here, as you can see, and we can have water be drained from the mostly unused upper section into the much more used lower section whenever we need it to keep the water going. So this keeps everything alive and just things carry on as normal. So I suppose the goal here is to eliminate the drought mechanic effectively through your engineering, which I think is a very nice game objective. Need to edit this levee system here because the water isn't going under the water wheel enough, but overall, this beaver town is basically fine. It's already pretty drought proof. We're not going to face any downsides to this level of drought, a 5-day drought. We've got enough water to get most of the way through it, and then we'll just struggle through onto the end. And once we have a few more walls, that's only going to get easier. We encounter issues during the next drought because we do run out of water in town number 2. Sort of stupidly, I have Town 2's water supply coming from the part that drains when there's a drought, so it's not taking water from the part I dammed off. Well, that was a missed opportunity, it seems. We're going to rapidly change that. And we'll also transfer some of the water from Town 1 to Town 2. We don't know, or didn't know, how much Town 2's stored water supply had in it. Well, we knew how much it had in it, we had a number. What we didn't know is the thing that number means, aka how long it lasts for. so I suppose I couldn't necessarily have known that we'd run out during this drought, but we could have done things better, suffice to say. So now I'm going to try and fudge the numbers here to make Town 1 send water to Town 2. There is that question mark on that UI element, by the way, and I tried to use that a couple of times, not quite sure what it does. Presumably it's there to tell people how that system works, because it's not completely obvious. Well, as far as I can tell, it didn't do anything, so I still didn't know. Of course I can look it up in real life, but that's against the rules of OffED playing a game, so I can complain about it. If the game doesn't have the information where it needs to be, I will lazily just not know and see how the game plays without the player knowing, from my own perspective at least. So maybe Town 2 will be fine. What I really want to do, as you can see here, is wall off this section and complete my plan of making the river even deeper at the back. The problem is, that part of the wall on the left there is not in range of the first town's building district, so it has to be built by the new town to the north instead, where it's just about in range, but they don't have easy access to the resources or the workers needed to build it, so it's very, very slow progress. Now here we are after the drought, where people are still thirsty down there, but they'll get over it at this stage. The thirst thing, where you gradually die of thirst, or hunger as well, is extremely slow, I found out. It's very generous about keeping the beavers alive during times of shortages, so it's sort of strategic almost. You can tactically have your beavers go like 10 days without having a drink and they'll be fine. I should also note, by the way, that they can't drink the river water because... And that's the reason. I think there is a reason in-game, or at least there could be. The reason that I would glean is that because we're in the post-apocalyptic future, the river water is poisonous or something, or acidic. So the point in pumping it out of the river and then storing it in a barrel is that this is cleaning it in some unspecified way. Why not specify it, I say? The other thing I should mention here while I'm thinking about it is that the whole water pumping system brings up the suggestion that you should be able to pump water sideways instead of just out of the river to move it places, instead of having the beavers carry it by hand, which is how it works at the moment. They put it in barrels and move it around. When I first started, I did expect there to be a pumping system because the building is called Pumping Station. It might be better to just call it Filter Station or something, because that's what it does. It doesn't really pump anything. Well, anyway, enough about that complaint. Maybe they can fix it in an update, which is what's happening right here on the screen. The game got updated to version 3 and it says that saves are not compatible, so that was nearly the end of my campaign. However, I found you could go back into the betas menu in Steam and switch it back to the old version. I do think they should have told you that you could do that on the update list, because a whole bunch of players won't know about that sort of more advanced feature and will just be screwed over by that update. Well, luckily we're back in the game, and that update was one of the things I mentioned earlier, where it allows you to recycle buildings and get resources back, so it is easier, I presume, in the new update. Unfortunately, we don't have that. Here I am tactically deleting some trees because the food supply in Town 1 is insufficient. We need to use more space for food and less for buildings and for trees. Unfortunately, with trees, they only have 2 models, sapling and fully grown, so it's hard to know if a tree is about to become fully grown, in which case you shouldn't delete it, you should wait for it to be harvested to get the wood. Well, I ended up basically just deleting a whole bunch of trees willy-nilly because we needed the food sooner rather than later. And there's a second layer to this plan, and this is the fun part of the game, or another fun part of the game. When we start to just build up instead, we can take many of the buildings that we have on the ground that is irrigated and fertile, and move it to be on the roofs of other things. As mentioned, this is a slow and resource-intensive process, but now I have loads of planks stored up and loads of wood. It's okay for us to start spending big, basically. We're going to put things up here on the roof. It does also reduce the efficiency of your economy to put things on the roof, because the routes between buildings, their lengths matter. So the higher up buildings are in little skyscraper pockets, the further it is between buildings, if that makes sense, because you have to go up and down to get anywhere, as well as sideways, which is just slower. Well, anyway, I wasn't paying attention to the economy on that micro level, so we're doing it. We're making some more space. I also managed to flood the town again. This is another difficult section of the no numbers challenge, because you don't know how much water's flowing down the river and how much is flowing out the other side. It's kind of hard to guess where you should put the floodgates at to keep things vaguely stable, and it may be the case that you can't come up with a stable setup, so you'll always have an amount that will eventually flood your town. These dams at the end are particularly hard to work with, because With the floodgates, you can say, well, I've got 3 tiles worth of water going through per time unit. With the dam, it doesn't tell you how many tiles per second is going through, so it temptingly gives you some of the numbers you would need to work this out, but just not quite all of them. So it's still vibes based, and we got the vibes wrong. Luckily, by opening the floodgates, stuff will eventually drain through the town, because we know that at maximum flooding, the river is outputting faster than it's coming in. So that's our stopgap. We can unflood the town slowly, and we just have to hope it happens before the plants die, and it probably did. Here I am back in the second town, being overly cautious, I'd say, about building on top of things, potentially just because it's more entertaining to do it like this. I'm putting this warehouse on some houses, even though there's tons of spaces to build warehouses just all over the place, because I was sort of paranoid that I would need the space later. We totally don't. We'll see later on in the end game that we didn't really end up using very much space. It was only the first town where I've really over-farmed, essentially, that didn't have much space and needed to be built vertically. It's really less important than I thought it was going to be in the long run, but it's more fun than building things normally, and at least this first town does benefit from it to some degree. Or at least I benefited from it because I liked doing it, and this is a video game after all, so that counts for something. Now, how's life in my third town up here? Well, there is no life. I abandoned the new town because I couldn't keep the resource flow to it going, and it was just dying off constantly. It's too much micro to constantly be sending beavers to a town with no resources and then sending them back before they die. But I do want to try it again right now, specifically now, because we have the opportunity to try and finish this dam section here before the next drought, which is about to happen. And as mentioned, this section can only be built by this other town because of the ranges on the districts thing. Pretty annoying. So here we are, finally finishing off our dam, essentially a tiny bit too late. We finish it as the drought starts, so we don't have time to fill up this back section and flood things to give us extra reserve water. Although right now that's a good thing, because I also haven't finished the other wall I mentioned earlier that will protect the third town from being flooded around the edge of the mountains between that town and the river. Something, something, something. We flood the area the perfect amount for right now. That's what I'm saying. We then abandon that new town again, and everybody will come hide back here where there's now more food supply in the first town. The second town actually needs more food supply by the looks of things and has no wood as well, but it's one of those things where you sort of miss economic developments because the UI is constantly changing which town it's talking about. You can't monitor how things are going very easily, which just seems like another big weakness of having the economies be separate in the first place. But we're going to not rant about that for a brief time. Instead, let's get back to finishing my dream. We're going to wall off this section to the left of Town 3 and make an enormous lake at last. Here's an example of why we need that wall. Our current setup does flood Town 3 continuously, and the water in Town 3 has only one place to go really, and that's Town 1. So we've got a fancy way of completely destroying everything here if we don't get on and build this wall. Luckily, the beavers can build in the water, although they are rather water-averse beavers as beavers go. They're willing to walk in it a little bit and build in it somewhat. We end up flooding the lower town in my attempts to unflood the upper town, since my main weapon here is to open the floodgates more. I can unflood the upper part of the map by flooding the middle part of the map that I'm on, and hoping it will eventually go to the lower part of the map. We can speed that process up by finally deleting parts of this dam at the back. We need to have our final waterworks system be floodgates instead of dams, so that we can control the ultimate speed of water through the entire system. Here we are later, with that new wall in place, and that's much better. I've put a floodgate here though because I was planning more. I don't just want to block this area, I want to some extent to have the water actually flow through. So we're going to start building a major wall now, a long wall that goes around the edge of Town 3, utilizing the natural cliffs so that we only have to build half the wall, but even with that, it's going to be a slow and expensive process to make this. Luckily, we do have lots of trees around the place, so if I ship trees to Town 3 continuously, it won't take too long to do this. The idea being, we'll end up with a canal that will firstly allow us to irrigate Town 3 to some extent, and perhaps more importantly, will allow us to have an outlet, another place where water can leave the system without just flooding Town 3. Essentially, the more floodgates you have in your system, the better, because it gives you more options for controlling flow speed and flow amount. And the only reason I think to not build all of your dams entirely out of floodgates, since they can act as dams when they're fully up, is that it's more expensive, and perhaps the practical concern that once you've set up a dam like I have here, I would have to break the dam to replace part of it with floodgates now, and that would probably cause problems. Although I'm also flooding my own town deliberately to clear things out in the water system, it's all going fine. Not going fine though is this beaver that gets stuck. The beavers can't swim for some reason, as I mentioned, so this beaver is now considered stuck because they're in the water. How they're in the water, I'm not quite sure. I think they fell off the platform here because I deleted it while it was being built or something. I'm trying to get a power system going so that water wheel can connect to the building on the shore. So you have to put power shafts out there, but you have to build them on top of these platforms. And essentially not much is happening here. Another case where the stuff I need to build the platforms is made by that building that I'm trying to supply. So it's a slow process where I end up having to import stuff. And I eventually discovered through my analysis of the stuck beaver scenario that you can put stairs into the river. And that's how I found out that little tidbit. And it does change things up. Once you have stairs going down into a river, your beavers are much more willing to do stuff in the water and build in the water. It just makes things way easier. So here we are later, the stuck beaver is gone, and it was while that beaver was stuck, for a long time actually, that I discovered just how long it takes for a beaver to die of starvation. I was going to let them die because I couldn't work out how to save them. I discovered them right at the end of their death cycle, so I did save them. But we learned an important lesson with this unethical experiment, that the beavers are quite hard to kill. Time for another drought, an 8-day drought, the longest one so far, but we've got a lake in front of our town, or upriver from our town I should say, so we've got loads of water to flow through. And as it turns out, as it will turn out, this is enough. We can keep the water flowing for pretty much the entire time and not run out, so nothing bad's going to happen because of this. We are golden, and after the drought, I finished setting up some of my new irrigation system for Town 3, so let's check it out. The lake is super full, and some of it will now flow through this channel. This will not only allow a lot of Town 3 to be grown upon, but in theory, as mentioned, this will provide an outlet for the lake system so it doesn't overflow, but in practice it does not. You can probably tell I haven't finished building the channel, so maybe this was never going to work, but what I figured would happen was that if the channel goes to the back of the town and points towards the edge of the map where the water is going, that it might just keep going that way afterwards. That was my plan anyway. This does not work. It causes the water to spread out in all directions if it ever leaves the channel, so it doesn't have momentum, and when ground looks flat, it is flat. There's no sort of downhill bias because the right-hand side of the map is technically lower down. That's where the water's going. That's not how it works at all. So essentially, we shoot water out in all directions from the end of this channel, and one of those directions is into the town, so we once again found a way to flood the town. It's all going very well, and if I close the floodgate to stop that, the water will just overflow the entire channel and flood the town even more. What I need to do is make the channel go to that little passage through the cliffs to the north, but I can't because of this district range system. We're held back once again. And once again, I can overcome this. I could just slap down another town right next to this one, just to build that final section of the wall. This is doable in the game. There is a way to build anywhere on the map, but that way is the deadly combination where it's not hard, it's trivially easy to do it, but it takes a long time and it's kind of boring and it's kind of a distraction. This is one of these cases where it's easy for me to say, just cut this part of the game out entirely, aka just let me build anywhere from any district, because you can build anywhere in principle, but it's not a fun thing to do. You might as well just cut out the unfun part and say, let the beavers run as far away from their districts as they need to build something, even if that's super inefficient. It takes them ages to get there. They put down 1 log per day because the journey is so long. Still allow me to try and do that, because building anywhere is within the rules of the game. It's just that the rules make doing so disadvantageous in a meta sense, in that it's not fun for the player to do it. And obviously that's a legitimate design technique. You can make it so that you're not supposed to build anywhere because it's more challenging that way. but because you sort of can, it's just annoying. I feel like we need to cut all of this out, cut out all of the middle stages, and just let you build anywhere, just like in Caesar 3. Well, you can see what I eventually did. I had to make this second wall that goes around the town in a way that it's now on the edge of the build district's range. So we can wall off the town from the spillover at the end of the channel. It just means the water's going to be doing nothing in particular at the end. Although if it stays near the wall, it will irrigate more of the town, so that's something. But essentially, once that's all set up, we will have a safe way to have this lake be flooded, and it will overflow mainly somewhere else and not overflow into the town. So we're finally getting to a stable setup. And you might be asking, hey Devon, isn't the town flooding right now, as you're claiming that you're approaching a point when this isn't going to happen? Well, this time it was deliberate. I decided to try tactical flooding, because you can use your floodgate system to deliberately flood the town just as a drought starts, because this will both mean it doesn't flood very much since the water pressure goes down, and that water on the ground, sometimes it's not deep enough to count as flooding buildings, so they still work, and it just provides irrigation to the ground, and it takes a while to go away, so you sort of get an extra day of water if there's just water on the ground everywhere. This is a very pointless way of keeping your water supply up. If you've really maxed out all your options for storing water, you can store it on the ground. And especially if you have tons of food, it doesn't matter if you storing it on the ground kills off your crops, because you don't really need them at this late stage in the game when we've got tons of food actually. So flooding the entire town wouldn't be that bad. We don't really need to produce anything, we don't need to produce food, we just need to survive. And having the town be somewhat underwater would make that better if there was a very long drought. Luckily this drought is less long than the previous one, and we have more water stored up in the lake than last time, so essentially we are fine, and that's going to be the theme running forward from here. This setup that I've made, once I finish making it at least, will be pretty much drought proof. And I say that with confidence because there are limits, as it turns out, on how long the droughts can be, and they're much shorter and more lenient than I expected while building up to this point. So we're going to start talking about the end game now, effectively, or what I will call more accurately, the lack of an end game. What I imagined would be the case was that at some point we'd need a whole lot of water, so I was thinking we can make our lake even deeper, ready for this sort of end game event that will come about, or some sort of big challenge. You know, I'm someone who's played Frostpunk a bunch of times, and I thought I see where they're going with this. At some point it's going to be really hard and they'll really test us. Well, not necessarily, but let's play along for now. Let's pretend what I'm doing here is useful. We're going to make this lake deeper, because I noticed the lay of the land allows us to make it one tile deeper if we do a certain amount of walling. So we double the height of the walls in towns 3 and 1. This also allows us to build up on this cliff on the other side from town 1, which I was interested in doing, because there was this natural channel with some dips further down going off to the side of the screen here, and I thought if we could get the water flowing here as well, or have a separate water source out here, put a reservoir out there, something like that, this would be good. Of course we're out of range here, so I can't build over there. And while I actually can build over there using the techniques we'll see in a second, I didn't really want to. It would be easy to move some water from right where the river's coming in to that section of the map if I could be bothered to do it, but I was happy enough just micromanaging the 3 towns and balancing their numbers as it was. That was already enough for me. So we are going to make some more towns actually, but not in a substantial way. We'll see what I'm talking about in a second. So we've got our wall set up here. One downside to this wall is that your floodgates can only be 3 tiles high. So there will always be 3 tiles worth of gap at the top, and that's going to severely limit my ability to actually deepen the lake, and we'll have to deal with that later on. But in principle, we've got our side of the map set up ready to flood. However, it's not actually going to work as it stands for a reason we'll see in a second. I also need, by the way, to wall off the back of Town 1, because my little channel going around Town 3 can potentially have the water go all the way around a mountain and flood our other town from the other side. Didn't pay attention to that earlier. I can just about build here. We're within build range but outside of beaver range, so the path will tell me that this is out of range. But if I clicked on the district center, it would say I can build there. Basically, your beavers can move a bit further away than they can normally move if it's only for building stuff. Almost what I want, but I think they should be able to move anywhere, of course. Well, there is a way to make beavers move anywhere. I keep mentioning this, we're finally going to look at it. I'd actually already done it at this stage, so I knew it was possible. Here's an example of how to do it. I need to wall off over here because my lake plan actually doesn't work, because this section of the map goes into the void. So water that's overflowing the banks of the lake will go in that direction and prevent the lake from getting deeper. So we need to put a wall here. To do that, we start a new little district, which is just going to have this distribution receiving post, which doesn't require any employees. So now I can freely move resources over to that location near the build site for the wall. Then later I can move beavers there to build it. And we will do the thing I keep saying, we will in effect have given ourselves infinite building range. Our beavers will walk all the way over there carrying the resources, and they'll also walk all the way over there to build stuff. So we've very nearly got how I want the game to be. There are just loads of extra steps in the middle, and as I said earlier, those steps don't add challenge, they're not a fun part of the gameplay. So since the game allows me to do this in an annoying way, it might as well just go all the way and let me do it in the normal way, just let it happen naturally. And it wouldn't make the game any different, it wouldn't affect the balancing, it would just be a bit nicer to play, I think. Well, here's something we can do with this setup. We can watch this beaver taking some planks from Town 2 through Town 1, now through Town 3, on an adventure. You do have to have your build site be connected by roads to your distribution centers to take resources there. Luckily, making roads in this game is free and doesn't require the builders to do it, which is a very generous addition. I would not have expected that, which only further heightens the extent to which we can sort of overcome the build range mechanics in an annoying way, because there's no limit on where you can build the roads. You can cover the entire map in roads right at the start of the game if you want. There's just no particular advantage to doing so. But yes, we've got what we need right here. The logs and planks are going over to the new town. And as an example of how this works, you can see at the back of the map, I've actually done this before. I guess I deleted the footage or something, I don't have it for some reason, but here I built this wall at the end of the river. This is much less important. It just allows the lake at the back of the map to be slightly deeper during droughts. We don't really need it to be like that, but I think it helped with irrigation, which is why I wanted to do it. And I was just testing the idea of whether you can have this completely disconnected town and still have it work. And because the beavers don't really die for a long time when they don't have food and water, as mentioned earlier, it's okay to have these workers out here with terrible conditions and not build up the rest of these towns, so you're just using the district to make the buildings and then you get out of there. I actually couldn't quite complete the wall over here because there's a hole in the ground that's hard to see that stops the beavers from walking right up to where the final piece of the wall needs to be. This was overcome by putting a path on top of the wall. The tile itself was out of build range despite being next to the district because of the annoying hole setup. But with this path, we can do it, so we can wall off the entire place. Now we evacuate the district, essentially just send everyone back before they die. You can see they're all complaining because there's no water. And then we can, in principle, flood this area. Although in practice, for various reasons we can't, and one of the reasons is it's about to be a drought season, so there's not going to be too much water to flow into here anymore. Just a shame we didn't finish it earlier to test it on this drought. But this drought was fine, as I recall, so we'll try it on the next one. There's another water thing I discovered around this time, and that is dumping water into artificial pools. You can make the opposite of a pumping station, where your beavers will walk up to a building and throw water out of it. So you can use that to move your water manually to different places. And you can store up little pools of water like this one in the corner of town 2. The purpose of this was just to irrigate some more space, which we don't really need, but I needed something for the beavers to do, basically. We're just dealing with unemployment by making stuff. And you could, in principle, have quite a few of those buildings and have it work like an artificial water source by moving water into an entirely new water system separate from the original or the natural one. But we're not going to do that, just in principle you could do it. I think I tried to put tons of showers on that pool, but the rest of the pool was out of build range, so it ended up not really doing anything. Now here we are a bit later with our lake starting to come together now. It's starting to flood the wider section and the rest of it's getting deeper. We're held back though by my floodgate system, as mentioned earlier, so what I need to do is have 4 tiles worth of floodgate ability over here at the main dam section. What I quickly found is that putting a 4th 1 tile high floodgate above the section not blocked by the 3 tile high floodgate does not work, because it just straight up doesn't let you build there. I'm guessing some sort of exploit or something, or a glitch existed that revolved around doing this and they just stopped you from doing it. So my original plan to have 4 tiles worth of floodgate isn't going to happen. But what we can do is build the floodgate on top of a levee and just still have the same amount of floodgate control as before, but it will at least be in the right place. Those among you who are incredibly clever might ask, is it a good idea to work on the dam by deleting it while the water is behind it? Well, yes, this causes some flooding indeed. And is it also a good idea to start this work in the last 2 seconds of the working day? Well, for that we can deal with the problem. You might have seen I just increased the amount of working day time to 24 hours. This just means the beavers will never go to sleep in this setup, so they'll work on the dam during the night and get this done as soon as possible. But yes, the town gets flooded. But no, it doesn't really matter, because it's only going to be flooded a little bit, and the town's kind of fine economically. We don't need it to be functional at this stage, so it's fine to sometimes have it be just completely destroyed. Even the crops can be destroyed. And it was all resolved faster than expected, as you can see there, because after I put the first levee down, that means there are now only 2 blocks of water flowing through, which is about the same amount that's flowing out the other end of this river, and it ends up clearing the flood even before the rest of the dam, the main part, has been put back. So I'm guessing what's going on here is the water physics doesn't model something like water pressure, where the weight of this gigantic reservoir behind the dam should be meaning that lower tile of open space will be absolutely blasting water through super fast. So that doesn't happen, meaning we are saved. We can then go through and gradually do the same thing to the other pieces. This time I'm going to do it in the morning rather than the evening, so we can have the guys do it on the regular shift, and they won't complain about being tired. I don't know to what extent being tired actually matters. I think you get a small debuff or something if you never let them sleep. Maybe they eventually die if you never ever let them sleep. So we flood the town again and continue on our merry way. Eventually we end up with this setup. We can completely flood that rear lake up to the very top, and now we have some more water back there. Is that useful? Well, not necessarily, because there is no end game, as I was saying, so we've stored up a whole load of water. We don't need it, but hey, we stored up a whole load of water, and that was a fun thing to do. You might even be thinking I could put another wall back over here at that work camp, and have another tile of depth into the lake. The issue at this stage was to make the lake even bigger. I'd have to put so many walls around the town, because now the terrain itself would be flooded over, and we'd have to just make a completely artificial dam that went across the entire map. No more use of the mountains from here on. And because we don't need to do that, even though I did actually want to do it, I was thinking about doing it, I ultimately decided not to, because, as you might note, nothing's happening in terms of gameplay challenge. We're just doing this for my own personal amusement, and I'm done being amused by it, I suppose. That's that. So what we don't have is something to do right at the end, and as mentioned, the obvious option, the screaming option, is to just have a long drought. Like, all these mechanics are there in the game ready to be used. They just need to throw in a Frostpunk style thing where you have to survive 30 days, and then it pops up and says, you win. That's all you really need. I know it's early access, so it doesn't have to have a full ending or anything, but it's just a text box and a thing that says triple the length of the droughts, whatever your setting is for the current game. Should be easy, it feels like anyway, to throw that in, and have there be a lot more purpose to everything else as a result. There is another thing you can do, and it's make your number go up, and here's a look at what the numbers are made up of. All of your town's various facilities contribute to the well-being of the town, and you can make the number go up by providing the rest of the facilities and different food types, essentially. We haven't really finished building the town's tech tree of available buildings. There are all sorts of things you could do aside from what I've done here. But, as we've seen, you don't need to, and I don't feel compelled to go any further in the tech tree. Essentially, we never did anything with the metal I was harvesting. There's a whole metal tier of stuff. You can even make robots, which I suppose is helpful. Maybe they don't eat food or something, although I think you have to give them biofuel instead. Well, there is something to do. You can make a number go up, but we're already above the highest number you need for gameplay purposes. It goes up a lot higher, but nothing happens, so I'm just not going to do it. I suppose that's the end game as it exists, but as I said, I think throwing in an actual end game would be relatively easy in this scenario, or with this game setup they have here. During the next drought, I built some more stuff around Town 3 to make it be irrigated more, but you can see we're already about halfway through an 8-day drought, and we haven't really got through most of the first tile of our reservoir, so we clearly have way more water than is required for this length of drought. And I must make a meta note here essentially, in that I wondered whether they would get longer if I waited a long time, and I went and looked it up, and somebody on Steam was saying that it doesn't really work like that. Essentially, your droughts are just random lengths, but up to a maximum, and I think the maximum is 9 days. And here after 8 days, well, we did use up the first tile of our reservoir, the tile of depth, but there's plenty more in there, so we could easily have gone another 8 days, and essentially this town has completed the game. It doesn't need to be any better, even though it can get a lot better, and I think it would be fun to make it better, but I think the game needs to make me do it. It needs to pop up saying, oh no, in 1 year, there'll be a year without water or something like that, so you can really focus down and use your productivity to do something in particular, not just because it makes your well-being go up or because you are a madman like me that wants to see the water get deeper. Well, that's the end of that. A little post-game thing that I noted you can do is blow up the ground. You can manufacture dynamite, which I think you could use to start destroying mountains and work the terrain a bit more, do stuff that I wanted to be doing in the beginning, and then the late game would be something else, essentially. But it's here in the game. Interestingly, you can put the explosives underwater and they still work. So you could make your various levees and reservoirs deeper using this to store more water, and wouldn't that be nice? Well, it probably would, but it doesn't matter. So that's something we could do with this economy, and as I said, there's a metal tier of buildings that do all sorts of things and make your beavers happy. You can make a carousel or something and watch them spinning around, and that's a beaver utopia. Well, I suppose that's the end of the game, really. It doesn't have an ending, as I'm saying, but maybe one of the many upcoming versions will throw something in the vein of a drought challenge, I'm sure, nice and easy. Now, a little note about the map. Something I thought the entire time playing was that the maps were randomly generated. I'm not sure why I thought that, but eventually, I think it was while I was looking up whether the droughts ever got longer, I saw a developer broadcast of the game that happened to be live on Steam, and they were playing on the same map as me, and I was like, oh, it's a default map, and I thought that's interesting because the map's not that good. It felt like it had been randomly generated. It wasn't made specifically to be interesting as the default map or be challenging or something like that. So I started exploring more about this map system in the game, and there is a lot to do in terms of maps. First and foremost, as you can see here, you can just make a custom map. This is probably what I would have done if I wasn't filming or trying to sort of investigate the game's challenge. I like the idea of making a weird custom map. In particular, this extremely creative map I'm making here, where it's just random noise all over the place, I think would be really good for this game, because it creates huge numbers of pockets of low and higher terrain that could be used to make some sort of intricate and detailed water management system. So I think just a completely chaotic random map would be pretty good. You can actually make custom difficulties too, as well as maps, and with this I can sort of get what I wanted in theory here. I can make the droughts really long, and then just have it so that there's one drought eventually, so the entire map is building up to some unbeatable challenge, and it's just a case of seeing how far you'll get through the mega drought by the time it happens. Have you built up long enough to survive for X number of days? Who knows? So that's something that you can do in the game, and I'm thinking that should be what the game is from the beginning, or something more like this should be the default behavior, because it just feels like there would be more purpose to everything else in the game if there was a big challenge that you were building up to, especially because the normal challenges are far too easy for what the game allows you to do, at least in my opinion. Here I am looking at one of the other pre-made maps you can play on, and we sort of get the ideal form of this game here. All you need to do is look at the map and imagine where you would take the water. Imagine where you would want your water management system to end up. Look for cool places to make rivers, or easy places like that one right there. We could make a dam that would then have a river force its way up this channel and fertilize tons of space next to our starting area with even the end game resources in it. So we're sort of good to go if we just dam off that tiny space down there. And I think I looked around and saw some other places you could force the water to go to make some more rivers and fertilize more of the map. And once you've got that game plan, like I'll build a town here, a town here, a town here, I sort of thought, well, I'm not going to do it because I know I can do it. It's very easy to do. I just like looking at the map and designing what would happen, which brings me all the way back to my points from earlier about having a game be about reacting to the map and just doing the water management would probably be a bit more interesting than mainly focusing on the city building aspect, because that aspect doesn't matter an enormous amount as the game is balanced right now and in the grand scheme of things. Well, anyway, I suppose we should sum up when it comes to Timberborn, and all I can do really is go back to what I said right at the beginning. It needs more beaver stuff in it. I think this game has a nice, unique selling point, and they've made some good mechanics for it, but they need to use them a lot more. We need to see, in my opinion, an early game beaver-based economy where you're mainly living in water, and you're mostly building things that change watercourses and allow you to build aquatic environments, with the goal of getting the water closer to the resources you need to evolve up and become the dominant species on the surface, and then the surface stuff would come later as you need the water less and less for your civilization, giving you some sort of end game, and then slap an end game challenge on the end. Just put a multiplied by 5 line in the code somewhere on one of the droughts. That's all you need to do, and or maybe a text box that pops up saying you win if you don't lose. So that's about it really. Obviously, because this is an early access game, we can't complain too much. As I mentioned long ago, it's got plenty of leeway to change things. It seems that what they've got here is enough to make a game, and it's very nearly there. So with the larger changes I'd like to see, I would probably think this is really good. With the smaller changes, like throwing on an ending, it's at least compelling as a city builder. Not necessarily better than other city builders, it's very similar and probably more simple than many city builders, but it's still got the same gameplay loop of building things so that you can build other things. You just need a destination to that path somewhere to make it all a bit more worthwhile, I think. But pretty good. I'll say at the very least that when I was playing it, I wanted to continue playing it and was sort of disappointed that there wasn't a point in doing so. Probably then the answer is come back in a few years, because they're still working on this thing, but as a point of criticism, they've been working on this thing. It's been publicly available and out to purchase for years, as far as I can tell, so they're making it slowly at the very least. But you know how things have been in the last few years. Maybe there is a reason it's sat in beta and then early access for a long time, and only has a very low version number. They clearly had a lot planned that they just never implemented, even though it's out on the market right now, which is a strange situation, but I suppose that's how early access works. I just don't really like it personally. That's it for Timberborn. Add more beavers and I'll come back for Timberborn 1.0 to see how it's changed perhaps.